This is Federalist 31, Part 4. It says the start of paragraph 10. Now what Hamilton is going to do is going to look at some of what the anti-federalists are saying, and he's going to give you a general picture of it. So he says anti-federalists are saying these are some of our reasons that we don't want you to be able to tax. These are some of the reasons that we don't want the federal government to be able to tax the citizens directly. And all the other criticisms that they have. So Hamilton just says, okay, let's look at all the criticisms that they have. So he says, those of them which have been most labored with that view seem in substance to amount to this. So from here on out, he says, this is what they're criticizing us with in the newspaper articles that they write, in the pamphlets that they write. It is not true because the exigencies of the Union may not be susceptible of limitation, that its power of laying taxes ought to be unconfined. Revenue is as requisite to the purposes of the local administrations as to those of the Union, and the former are at least of equal importance with the latter to the happiness of the people. It is therefore as necessary that the state governments should be able to command the means of supplying their wants as that of the national government should possess the like faculty in respect to the wants of the Union. But an indefinite power of taxation in the latter might, and probably would in time, deprive the former of the means of providing for their own necessities, and would subject them entirely to the mercy of the national legislature. As the laws of the Union are to become the supreme law of the land, as it is to have power to pass all laws that may be necessary for carrying into execution the authorities with which it is proposed to vest it, the national government might at any time abolish the taxes imposed for state objects upon the pretense of an interference with its own. It might allege a necessity of doing this in order to give efficacy to the national revenues, and thus all the resources of taxation might by degree become the subjects of federal monopoly to the entire exclusion and destruction of the state governments. So he says, because in the Constitution it says this Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and also it says that all laws that may be necessary for the carrying into execution the authorities with which it is proposed to vest. In other words, in the Constitution, it tells the supreme law of the land is the Constitution, and anything that federal government needs to execute its laws to do, it can do. He says, well, in that case, how should we know that the federal government will not one day say, well, I need these taxes to come to me rather than to the states because what I'm doing is more important than the states are. And he says pretty soon, with some sort of excuse, all the money that's supposed to go to the state governments will be redirected to the federal government, and that will mean that state governments will be destroyed, and federal government will act like a national government and will take all the power away from the states. So he says these are the criticisms that anti-federalists are writing in the paper. And he's going to answer them here in the next paragraph. And he says, this mode of reasoning appears sometime to turn upon the supposition of usurpation in the national government. At other times, it seems to be designed only as a deduction from the constitutional operation of its intended powers. It's only in the latter light that it can be admitted to have any pretension to fairness. So he says there's one part of it that we think that the criticism is fair. When they criticize us, they're fair. And also, don't forget, I forgot to say it in the last paragraph, remember the whole idea of American Revolution was because they were saying taxation without representation is not right. So Americans have always been, and especially at that time, very sensitive to the idea of taxation. So this issue was very important for them, and they had a point saying, well, how do we know that the federal government is not going to act like the British monarchy at one time and just say, well, we need you guys to give us taxes, and we don't care what you say, we don't care what the states say. And so keep that in mind. Some of this criticism is fair. So go back to reading it. It is only in the latter light that it can be admitted to have any pretensions to fairness. The moment we launch into conjectures about the usurpations of the federal government, we get into an unfathomable abyss and fairly put ourselves out of the reach of all reasoning. Imagination may range at pleasure till it gets bewildered amidst the labyrinths of an enchanted castle, and knows not on which side to turn to escape from the apparitions which itself has raised. Whatever may be the limits or modifications of the powers of the Union, it is easy to imagine an endless train of possible dangers, and by indulging an excess of jealousy and timidity, we may bring ourselves to a state of absolute skepticism and irresolution. I repeat here what I have observed in substance in another place, that all observations founded upon the danger of usurpation ought to be referred to the composition and structure of the government, not to the nature or extent of its powers. The state governments, by their original constitutions, are invested with complete sovereignty. In what does our security consist against usurpations from that quarter? Doubtless in the manner of their formation and in a due dependence of those who are to administer them upon the people. If the proposed construction of the federal government be found, upon an impartial examination of it, to be such as to afford to a proper extent the same species of security, all apprehensions on the score of usurpations ought to be discarded. So at first he says all of these people that are criticizing us are talking about imaginary things. It seems like they are dreaming. Remember when he says labyrinths of enchanted castle, when he's using those words, he says these people are not even thinking about reality. We are not going to take states away. We are not going to take state power away. The national government is not. Plus, state governments have a lot of power themselves. It's the way the Constitution is written that the national government will not mess around with certain things that only state can do. So he says if you're fair, if you're open-minded, and if you read this new Constitution and look at what we say, you will see that federal government will not usurp state authority. State authority will be there, and because the state is so close to the people, physically speaking, federal government cannot overstep its bounds, cannot go over the limit that has been given to it. So we will continue in the next video with part 5 of Federalist 31.